I read through Karl Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, which has been the foundation partly for most of today's liberal powers, as well as for the global power of the UN. We might note that the name and principles of George Soros's Open Society Foundation is inspired by this book. And while reading, I couldn't help but notice certain tendencies of Popper, tendencies that might cause one to doubt how liberal and intellectually honest he really even is. And naturally, this has direct consequences for we who live in the so-called liberal West. I think what liberalism is today is perhaps best represented by the exhortations made in this book. Thus, I have decided to make a critique of it as a whole to show the duplicitous paucity of liberal thought. Now, before I get on with my video, I want to clarify some terms. The word liberal has undergone several historical transformations. Originally, the word liberal, of Spanish origin, liberales, simply signified a person who valued liberty. A liberal in that sense could be a monarchist, or even as Erich Ritter von Quinault-Leden states, a supporter of a traditional dictatorship, assuming that a known repression is better than a more total oppression in a democracy. However, it then became associated directly with democracy. Then the word became used by the classical liberals, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to denote self-government. But the founding fathers of the United States were skeptical of the ability of democracy, by which they meant direct democracy, to uphold liberty, and so they opposed liberalism to democracy and opted instead for republicanism. Today, however, the distinction has entirely disappeared, which according to von Leden began with Andrew Jackson. Today, liberal is now synonymous with democracy, and when someone self-describes as a liberal, they mean they support either Republican or parliamentary democracy. As such, when I use the term liberal in this video, I mean liberal in the modern sense with its full association with democracy. In one sense, Popper might be able to say that he's a liberal despite his skepticism of democracy. If he thinks that a bureaucratic authoritarianism better guarantees freedom than a democracy, then sure, he can claim to be a liberal. But simultaneously, Popper also lionizes at least the word democracy. Since that's the case, his status as a liberal in the modern sense is quite dubious. And to note one further problem, he isn't much of a fan of freedom either, despite what he says. I will clarify where Popper stands on democracy later. Spoiler alert, he is anything but democratic. He is also not quite fond of freedom. So I think in either way we define the word liberal, Karl Popper is not much of a liberal. He is instead what liberalism has become. Second, I also want to critique the thesis of this book. The basic dichotomy in this book is the closed society versus the open society. The closed society is a parochial one based on heredity, tribe, and tradition, where dissent is forbidden and conformity is required. It is a collectivist society where the individual is subsumed into the whole. Tradition stands in the place of science and inquiry, criticism is suppressed, and in which the principle of equality is rejected. The open society, on the other hand, is a so-called democratic society in which individual equality is taken as the foundation, and free inquiry rather than parochial tradition is the general epistemic method. Popper's framing of the difference between traditional societies and liberal societies is completely stereotypical and self-congratulatory. I mean, who doesn't want to live in an open society? Who would want to live in a closed society? This is the same rhetorical trick leftists use when they call themselves socialists. Who doesn't want to be social? Liberals do the same thing. What's bad about being a liberal? Anyone of reasonable intelligence should have reason for pause when they encounter rhetorical tricks like this. It ought to give one the sneaking suspicion that the author is covering something up, that he has to sweeten the poison a little bit to convince you to swallow it down. We will see throughout this review that Popper is indeed concealing something with the phrase open society. Namely, it is a kind of bureaucratic authoritarianism that creeps into every aspect of one's life through what he calls piecemeal social engineering. It is totalitarian in everything but name. So now let's address Popper's stereotypification. In the first place, not all traditional parochial societies quashed criticism and inquiry. We of course have to note the diversity of thought in the classical period. Then in the Middle Ages, despite the influence of Christianity, there was a thriving occult scene where writers like Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa were able to publish entire books of occult philosophy. This should be a great litmus test because if Christians wanted to suppress anything, it would be the occult, which stands in direct opposition to Christian belief. Even in Catholic Europe, there were poets who were writing about homosexuality, and during the Renaissance, which was a period of the revival of ancient Greek thought, there was such a diversity of thought and such a confluence between pagan and Christian philosophy and mythology that it forces us to recognize the actual extant freedom and diversity of thought that existed in traditional society. Of course, one can point to the fact that the Catholic Church banned certain books, but modern societies hardly differ in this respect. Horizontal pressure leads to the impossibility of profitably publishing certain books. For example, Camp of the Saints has been out of print for a long time due to its anti-immigrant themes, despite a surge in popularity during 2016 and 2018. There are also several retailers who refuse to stock certain books. For example, Jared Taylor's White Identity is gone from Amazon, as well as Kevin MacDonald's Culture of Critique. Neither book contains overt racism nor anti-Semitism, and yet they both have been banned. In the UK, certain books are directly banned because the state classifies them as extremist material. These are usually books that promote nationalism or contain racist themes. Although one could argue that Popper would support the UK's book bans due to his paradox of tolerance, which is a concept I will address later in this review. But doesn't this mean that Popper supports elements of the closed society? Isn't he just making liberalism and its self-perpetuation parochial and unquestionable? So much for free inquiry. How does this in any way resemble an open society? We can see how his own stereotype for the most optimal and just society ends up collapsing when we investigate what Popper means rather than what he says. Popper will also argue that the logic of the closed society inevitably leads to the Inquisition, but the Inquisition is just a relatively small ripple in the breadth of Christian history. Every religious society changes over time, and they will sometimes trend toward or away from fundamentalism. This fundamentalism is in no way a necessary component of a traditional society, as classical societies largely were without it. A survey of today's Islamic countries shows that the degree of fundamentalism varies from country to country. In Afghanistan, the fundamentalist Taliban have banned music, dance, and various kinds of media. Islamic countries also typically ban alcohol, but if you go to Malaysia, the interpretation of Islamic moral law is much more lax, and they do not go as far as to ban alcohol or to ban music. If you go to Bosnia, which is a Muslim-majority country, they actually produce their own alcohol called raki, despite Hadiths forbidding alcohol. If we go back in time, Muslim elites typically consumed alcohol, and to switch gears a bit, the availability of prostitution in medieval European societies indicates that medieval Christendom was actually not very fundamentalist, with the exception of the church itself. If we are to declare that religion is responsible for witch hunts, then to be fair, and to check our hypothesis, we would also have to look at the degree to which modern secular societies engage in their own witch hunts against modern witches, or extremists. In the 1940s, there was a witch hunt against Japanese collaborators and spies, which led to them being rounded up into concentration camps. Although there was some evidence that the State Department was infiltrated by communists in the 50s, as revealed by the Venona cables, it's nevertheless held by mainstream historians that McCarthy and his list of communists was an example of a hysterical witch hunt. In today's society, the media and security apparatus continually catastrophizes about the influence of quote-unquote right-wing extremism and quote-unquote anti-Semitism. All one has to do to see the totality of this modern hysteria is to visit the website of the Anti-Defamation League, where they have declared that the OK sign is a symbol of white supremacy, and that nearly every number in the expanse of infinity is a racist dog whistle. This witch hunt against anti-Semitism has now, under the second term of Trump, led to selective deportations and persecution by the federal government against those who support Palestine. To pin the phenomenon of witch hunting completely on religion, as if 1, it naturally follows its principles rather than being a contingency, and 2, as if secular society is absent of this phenomenon, is completely indefensible. The open society is just as likely as the closed society to hunt down those who offend its values. I must also note that traditional societies did sometimes tolerate criticism of the government, the king, and the policies thereof. The left-right dichotomy originated with the Ancien regime, in which the right was loyal to the king's policies, while the left was critical of his policies, although still with the precondition of loyalty to the sovereign. This is where we get the phrase, His Majesty's most loyal opposition. We will see later that Popper's so-called open society does not actually value free inquiry any more highly than it was valued in the past as a result of universal education and the logic of ideological self-perpetuation. If we draw up the closed society versus the open society, we can see that both categories contain elements from the other. The open society contains ideological parochialism. The closed society contains elements of intellectual freedom and liberty. The open society contains collectivist elements such as militaries or the structures of schools, while the closed society has a great emphasis on personalism, such as its emphasis on artisanal production and its basis on interpersonal relationships between individuals. The reality of political history is not the clean dichotomy that Popper portrays. To begin with the book proper, Popper criticizes the philosophical and political thought of Plato. In his Republic, Plato denounces equality, argues for a form of collectivism of caste, a kind of communism for the ruling class, absolute conformity of the masses to the state, and submission of the individual interest to the state collective. Plato, in Popper's view, is the original thinker of the closed society. What's more than this, Plato, in Popper's view, is a historicist. Historicism, to Popper, is the belief that history unfolds in a deterministic fashion, such that we can derive grand theories of history and make definite long-term predictions based on certain laws, whether those be so-called scientific laws, as is the case in Marx's historical materialism, or divine laws, as was the case in classical antiquity. Popper believes that historicism is dangerous because the assumption that history is inexorable leads to the creation of grand designs of government that are generally totalitarian, which are aimed at predicting and managing these historical movements. Plato, like most people in ancient Greece, believed that there is at the beginning of time a divine golden age where men lived in perfect harmony and happiness. This led him to the belief in the original or divine city upon which his republic is based. Since the sensible world is corruptible, over time the divine city came to ruin. So for Plato, it was necessary to halt change as much as possible so that the Greeks could as much as possible recapture the harmony of the divine city of the Golden Age, even into the lateness of the ages. That is how Popper sums up Plato's historical theory. But is this paradigm accurate? Can we really say that Plato was a historicist? I don't think it's quite as clear-cut as Popper argues. To define historicism as a determinism of history is accurate as far as it goes, but Popper ignores that a historical determinism has a kind of fatalism attached to it that Plato did not share. If there is no fatalism, then the outcomes of history are not predetermined. Therefore, we cannot make grand predictions about history. To illustrate why I don't think Plato was a historicist, it's helpful to analyze Marx's historical materialism, which is a genuinely fatalistic and thus historicist doctrine. What distinguishes Plato's doctrine in the Republic from historical materialism is that, under historical materialism, the establishment of communism is a foregone conclusion independent of willful human actions. Marx derides certain laws of human action and political organization, such as class conflict and dialectics, and then reasons that, even if people were to make no active effort to achieve communism, that the scientific laws of human conflict would inexorably accomplish communism. Thus, we can predict from the laws of dialectics that the outcomes of history will be communism and nothing but communism. In contrast, Plato makes it very clear in the Republic that the re-establishment of the divine city is not an inevitability. Rather, it must be brought to fruition on account of human volition. In other words, it may or may not happen. What we see in Plato, thus, is actually a repudiation of historicism. Popper misreads the ancient idea of the cycle of ages as a Marxist-style historicism and proceeds to condemn Plato on the same grounds as he condemns Marx. In reality, the actual thought on the role of human action in the cycle of ages is quite diverse, as Popper himself even noted, but then promptly ignored. Some Greeks thought that decline was inexorable and that humans could do nothing to avert it. Some Greeks thought that the cycle could be halted or reversed. Plato clearly falls into the latter category. We can see in modern interpretations of this doctrine, such as we might find in René Guénon or Julius Evola, an emphasis on the role of human action during the age of decline. Evola thought, along with certain ancients, that it was possible to reverse the decline and to restore the Golden Age, or at least a miniature Golden Age. So in essence, he agrees with Plato. Guénon thought that there is a miniature cycle unfolding within the procession of ages, such that there are always momentary volitional revivals alongside cycles of decline. Both authors believed in freedom of will, with Evola almost divinizing it, and it's worth noting that Evola himself rejected all forms of historicism. The basic reality is that the doctrine that Popper is trying to wrestle with, the age cycle such that can be found in Hesiod's writings, is a lot more complex than he lets on. In fact, we will see a common tendency in Popper to rely on anachronisms in his analysis of the classical world. That he sees in both Marx and Hesiod the same doctrine proves that he is, in reality, privileging the modern interpretation of historical movements over the classical interpretation, conveniently so his comparative analysis can make any sense. This tendency toward anachronism is inspired by Karl Popper's disrespect for historical philosophy and historical writings in general. Popper is explicit in his belief that classical writings are most of the time just wrong or outdated, and that little to nothing of value can be found in them save for certain treatises on rhetoric or grammar. He's thus suspicious of anyone in the modern world whose view is inspired partly or greatly by classical writings. But his refusal to actually take the classical world seriously is why his analysis is so often incorrect. He is unwilling to take the time to understand concepts in the same way that the ancients did, and so he is forced to substitute his own modern understanding instead. This leads to errors such as when he tries to examine the ancient Greek meaning of the word justice. As Popper interprets it, Plato's idea of justice was just conformity to the state's laws. In contrast, he believed that the meaning of the Greek word justice actually meant something similar to the modern egalitarian conception of individual equality. Drawing from some marginal philosophers such as Antisthenes, as well as from a passage in which Aristotle was specifically talking about the concept of equality before the law, since all humans are technically equal before the gods, Popper concludes that by justice, Greeks simply meant equality. This, however, is an erroneous conclusion. Justice to the Greeks meant generally conformity to divine laws. Numerous sources confirm this, but chiefly we are concerned with the utilization of the word in both Plato and Aristotle's thought, but it also goes beyond their thought as well. Quote, the Greeks were devoted to their laws partly because of the belief in their superhuman origin, but partly because the general principles embodying the law were believed to be perfect and permanent and not subject to change at the will of the people. Nature was the source of law, and the duty of the state was ordinarily considered to be the application rather than the creation of the law. Law, to the Greeks, was moral because it was natural, and therefore it constituted the cement of the city-state. Law was the same for all, and therefore, in a way, it meant freedom. Obedience to laws was an essential element in the Hellenic conception of liberty. To the Greeks, the city-state was both a church as well as a political institution, and its end was to promote among its citizens goodness and justice, the latter representing an ideal perfection in human relationships. End quote. This is from Bandari, 2002. Evola, a traditionalist who was familiar with many classical texts, had the same conclusion about the traditional concept of justice, which meant human conformity with the superhuman and divine. Something was just not because it conformed to human standards, such as equity or equality, but rather to divine standards, which implied the existence of a hierarchy. Now, it is said that the Greek notion of law indicates the origin of law in nature, but we have to understand that what the Greeks meant by nature is not what we today understand to be nature. Nature, to the Greeks, was not just physical laws and evolutionary processes. Rather, nature was divine. Nature was the cosmos, meant in the sense of a divine order of things. Nature was the immanent world and its manifestation of divine qualities. All Greek laws were derivative of divinely established virtues, and Greeks sought to live law in accordance to that which was above them. Thus, when Plato defines justice as conformity to the laws of the divine city, he is actually utilizing the commonly understood Greek definition of justice. That justice would, to some radical thinkers of Plato's time, mean something akin to equality is not the norm, but rather an aberration. And to portray justice as simply equality before the law is based on incomplete reasoning. The emphasis on this equality was based on the fact that law was divine and thus governed all humans equally, since mankind is not above the gods. It did not mean anything close to the liberal conception of a secular equality of law. Popper is actually presenting abnormal views of justice as if they were actually normal. And the kicker here is that the basis for Popper to declare that when Plato defines justice as conformity to the divine state, he is engaging in intellectual dishonesty. He thinks that Plato is trying to trick Greeks who believe that justice is good into agreeing with his own personal redefinition of justice. But that simply isn't the case. What Plato was presenting is, beyond any doubt, exactly what Greeks generally meant by the word justice, that is, conformity with divinely inspired law. Now, at various times we can see in the book that Popper distrusts any notion of the general will. This is despite the fact that the original thinkers of liberalism, such as Rousseau, founded liberal democracy precisely on the general will, although they disagreed regarding how that will should be ascertained and what limits it sits in. It's worth noting that Popper is not in any sense a classical liberal. We could argue that the basic principle of democracy, whether it's liberal or not, is the expression of the general will of the people. If it is liberal, then we could argue that democracy means self-rule, or rule by the people. Rule by the people also implies a general will that governs. But in the general will, Popper actually sees the justification for fascist totalitarianism. In fascism, the dictator proclaims to represent the general will of the people, and so as far as it goes, what the dictator commands is what the people themselves have chosen. The logic of fascism and liberal democracy are thus actually somewhat similar, and this has led Popper to reject their common foundation. Instead, Popper seeks to found liberalism on a rationale of the self-preservation of institutions. We can see in Popper that, despite his democratic pretensions, he is actually very skeptical, if not outright hostile, to democracy. This is evident in his famous paradox of tolerance. The theory goes that if a democracy tolerates the right of the intolerant to engage politically, it will cease being a tolerant democracy, and perhaps may even lead to the end of democracy. Thus, Popper creates a justification for liberal states to use authoritarian measures and force to prevent the political activity of groups that offend the state's values. We can see this unfolding today in Georgia, Romania, and in Germany. In Georgia's 2024 election, the pro-Russian and anti-LGBT Georgia Dream Party had won election, but opposition parties accused them of engaging in election fraud and interference. They have since refused to officially recognize the outcome of the presidential election and are currently engaged in a parliamentary boycott. The EU has consequently condemned the results of the Georgian election as illegitimate. The obvious motivation behind this opposition is a general Western disapproval of the reign of a pro-Russian candidate, which they see as a threat to their political hegemony. So as soon as democracy proves to be intolerant, it is consequently seen as illegitimate and the will of the people is superseded. In Romania's 2024 election, another pro-Russian and anti-LGBT candidate, Călin Georgescu, had won the first round of elections in a surprise victory off the back of non-traditional campaigning on platforms like TikTok. The current president of Romania accused Georgescu of Russian influence and vote rigging, and a constitutional court eventually overturned the results of the first rounds of elections on the nebulous basis that the TikTok campaigns were quote-unquote similar to Russian propaganda. At no point was actual Russian influence ever found. Again, once the will of the people proves to be intolerant, democracy must be cancelled. Finally, in Germany, there have long been calls to ban the party AfD for allegedly right-wing extremism. This comes off the back of recent polls that have put the immigration skeptic party far ahead. This actually nearly did happen in May when the ADF was designated as a quote-unquote extremist organization, but the courts have since ordered German intelligence to withdraw that designation. Again, if the will of the people is intolerant, then democracy must be cancelled. All this is perhaps the result of the internalization of Karl Popper's principle of the paradox of tolerance. Popper then elaborates on what the essential paradox of rule by the people is, namely the paradox of freedom. In a democracy of majority rule, people would be free to vote against the democratic institutions or to elect the tyrant. In this way, democracy would be self-defeating since the principle of democracy would be used, eventually, to dismantle democracy. His answer to this problem is predictably to cast off any pretensions of democracy whatsoever by deferring to management by institutions. And this is hard not to see the parodies of Starship Troopers and Helldivers in the representation of an authoritarian democracy, which might be named something like managed democracy. It goes without saying that as soon as we strip the will of the people out of democracy, it ceases to even be democracy, since the root demo means the people, rule by the people. If it becomes rule by institutions, then it's no longer democracy, but instead an authoritarian bureaucracy that represents the whims of whoever happens to run the institutions. Of course, Popper, who dubiously pretends to be a democratist, is quick to rebut this implicitly, almost preempting this criticism. The answer to this problem is that institutions are controlled by the people. Except this isn't exactly true, because the whole point of institutional management is that it poses a limit on the will of the people. And how exactly does it do this? Precisely by shaping and controlling the exercise of democratic rights. Institutions decide which elections are valid, how elections are conducted, who is allowed to run for office, and if need be, when to disqualify candidates or annul elections. Institutions can effectively keep their own self-preservation intact at all times. We have seen just how this institutional form of democracy has worked in Romania and Georgia. It has been utilized foremost to nullify the will of the people entirely. Or in other words, it has caused the end of the rule by the people. Of course, we might think that there is another possible rebuttal to my argument, which is that institutions are quote-unquote neutral and somewhat impersonal, and thus cannot be a genuine ruling class. But Popper actually disagrees. He isn't willing to accept the dubious premise that institutions are not ran by people, and almost seems to argue that the lines between personalism and institutionalism are blurred. Keep note of this, as later Popper will again completely forget he said this. But nonetheless, I agree with this entirely. But it also means that Popper cannot avail himself of the defense of impersonalism to justify his managed democracy. If institutions are fundamentally ruled by humans, and if these people are a small clique of experts, then what we clearly have is a new kind of ruling class, an institutional and bureaucratic ruling class akin to that which existed in the Soviet Union. The problem of authority and tyranny is never actually overcome, and what seemed from the outset like a check and balance against majority rule actually just ends up killing democracy as a principle. Now, Popper does come up with an argument that actually surprised me. Perhaps we can succeed in showing that Popperian democracy is paradoxical, but what if individual sovereignty is paradoxical too? He argues that the paradox of freedom has a twin for sovereignty, namely the paradox of sovereignty. A sovereign whose rule is justified on personal and individual terms can easily decide to dissolve his own authority and institute a democracy, thus nullifying his sovereignty. But I don't think this argument is quite the blowout against the principle of individual sovereignty that Popper thinks it is. Popper has already argued that absolute and unlimited sovereignty does not actually exist, since a sovereign does not rule alone. I agree with this entirely, so the proposition that a sovereign's authority should be limited in the case where he tries to undo that sovereignty does not actually invalidate sovereignty, especially not a principle like the divine right of, which carries with it implicitly the doctrine that a ruler is unfit for his position if he destroys the office of the king, thus also offending the divine principle on which his authority rests. Divine sovereignty is possibly the most limited form of sovereignty, and so for a traditional reactionary, Popper's argument does not pose a problem whatsoever. Even in the case of modern autocracies, this paradox of sovereignty is not a problem, since the sovereignty of dictators is typically located in the general will. If the general will indeed wishes for democracy, then it would be no contradiction whatsoever for the sovereign to cede his authority. It reminds me what Joseph Goebbels said in one of his pamphlets, quote, "The question of the form of government is irrelevant for us today. A people that is being destroyed under the dictates of Versailles has other things to worry about than the question of monarchy or republic. This question can be decided by the people only when it is free," end quote. In the contrary position, that of popular sovereignty, this kind of sovereignty can truly be said to be unlimited. The people do not check and balance themselves, and any outcome of their voting becomes simply the general will. If we try to limit the sovereignty of the masses, then we have a situation where the actual principle of sovereignty for democracy is contravened. And in this case, it is pure and simply a contradiction. Thus, what is the paradox for democracy ends up not being a paradox at all for individual sovereignty, on account of the latter being, by nature, limited. Popper's next critique of Plato is his concept of educational rule. Plato believed that those who rule should be the wisest, and to facilitate this, he argued that the rulers should be appointed by the educators. Plato's concept of education includes conforming the actions and manners of the educated to fit as closely with state norms as possible, established by one who possesses wisdom, and to this Popper contrasts the Socratic concept of education, which he argues was more individualistic and equalitarian. The emphasis of Socrates was on teaching people self-criticism and modesty of knowledge. Wisdom for Socrates was based on the wise knowing what knowledge they lacked, not necessarily in possessing knowledge. For Plato, it was the opposite. The one who should rule is one who possesses knowledge. For him, education was mainly a tool to be used to groom the ruling class, whereas for Socrates, education was meant to give every man a strong foundation in wisdom. Popper, however, notes that Socrates also argued that education should be founded on a condition of enlightenment, a fact which Popper sees as promoting an authoritarian interpretation of education, such that those who lack wisdom must be under an authority who can wake them up.
You wake up.
Right.
Woke.
Right.
What this practically means for Popper is that the true purpose of education should be quite contrary to what Plato recommends. Instead of fostering obedience and loyalty, it should foster free inquiry, inquisitiveness, critical thought, and self-examination. This education should be extended to all people, not merely to a small elite. The purpose of this is to create a population that can question and balance the government's authority. The problem posed by Popper's institutional inhibition of democracy aside, the ultimate question is whether this actually even occurs in liberal, democratic societies of the kind that Popper defends. The way education is structured in liberal countries is pretty uniform. State or federal educational boards design the curriculum, and students are educated through the delivery of information, much of which, at least in the case of the humanities, is laden with biased perspectives and opinions, and students are then quizzed on the information. In the rare case where students are allowed to write their own papers, the opinion that the teacher wants is always implicitly given by way of the biased information. For example, if the teacher were to task the class with writing an essay on slavery in America, all the information that has been given was a lionization of abolitionism. Therefore, the possibility of a student thinking critically and arriving at the opposite conclusion of the course, namely defense of slavery, is unlikely. And even if it were offered, it would probably be punished as the incorrect conclusion. At no point in the curriculum are students ever exposed to a point of view in which slavery is defended. It should be without doubt that the modern educational system in the West is as far removed from the Socratic method as could be possible. And Popper actually agrees, stating alongside other writers that Plato is the true origin of modern education. Popper criticizes the notion of Plato's demand that education should be used as a selective mechanism on account of his theory that education rarely selects for genius, but modern schools do, in fact, have a selective role to play. It's rare for an elected representative to not have springboarded to his position off of a law degree, and the purpose of law schools and medical schools is to filter out people who cannot achieve accreditation and who thus would be incompetent and unintelligent. In other words, it is a convoluted IQ test. Everything about the educational system is determined from the top down by institutions and representatives, not by the people for whom education is most relevant. The Socratic method itself is very individual. It is a dialogue between two men interrogating the truth. The liberal system of education is collectivistic. The class as a whole is exposed to the same information, and then they are tested as to whether they have internalized it or not according to a uniform standard. To defend liberalism, as if it has been this great repudiation of the principles laid forth in Plato's Republic, is nonsense. The open society turns out to be a mirage. There's also, conversely, an aspect of education in liberal countries which is unabashedly authoritarian. As Foucault has written in several places, schools in the West tend to be engines of social and moral conformity, foundational on techniques of discipline. Is it even possible for there to be genuine self-examination or self-criticism in the Socratic style if people are not even allowed to fully express themselves? If all attenuation of unwanted behaviors is arrived at through external mechanisms, then of what utility is self-examination? Self-examination ends up becoming an examination of one's actions vis-a-vis various relationships of power that exist between the student and faculty. The self hardly factors into this equation at all. All discipline does is inculcate obedience, and obedience is often the direct opposite of the spirit or motivation behind critical thought and free inquiry. Even the means by which information is taught in schools, exposition and quizzing, does the opposite of facilitating the development of critical reasoning skills. It is simple regurgitation of the correct information. It is even so bad that in math classes, if a student arrives at the correct solution in a way that was not taught to him, the answer is marked as incorrect. Students have not been taught to question power, but rather to be obedient to it. The way Western liberal education functions is, in reality, little different from how education is conducted in authoritarian China. Now, we might be able to give Popper some credit for realizing that the current state of affairs is far from his ideal, but he gives little in the way of a substantive critique of modern education, and he has certainly not realized the fundamental contradiction of the idea of universal education and pastoralism vis-a-vis his Socratic ideal. If the purpose of education is to secure the well-being and productivity of a student, then it cannot be in any way Socratic. But this is precisely what school is supposed to do in the open society, so as to work toward eliminating inequality. To accuse the closed society of doing students an injustice, while our current open society so flagrantly violates all of the various elements of a genuinely Socratic system, means that Popper has quite a lot to apologize for. His defense of the open society cannot be squared with the fact that even the most open society that exists cannot manage to foster critical thinking universally in any capacity. And this is, as I will elucidate, because it is so concerned with its own self-perpetuation, just as Popper is. It stands to reason that not everyone in education thinks as highly of free inquiry as Popper, and the basic logic of the defense of the weak and defense of minorities has been applied to restrict inquiry into subjects like human intelligence and biodiversity. The demand for equity actually butts up against the demand for free inquiry, so we can see once again that the actual state of affairs for that which Popper defends approaches a mess of contradictions. If we just assume that everyone is equal without any evidence, so much for Popper being scientific, then we have already violated the principle of free inquiry. We are supposed to dismiss with our assumptions and view a problem de novo. We have to accept that we might be wrong. But if we assume equality, there's no world in which we can be wrong. In other words, the principle of equality is an enemy of free inquiry. Popper has not realized this contradiction. Now, there's something that Popper did not address and perhaps did not see, but free inquiry has the same issue as that of democracy, the paradox of freedom. If you allow people to think freely, they might start to question liberalism and begin adopting illiberal ideas. The secret behind Popper's love for free inquiry is that he thinks free inquiry necessarily begets liberal attitudes, but the basic fact is that it does not necessarily do so. Popper's response to the problem of freedom in a democratic context is to stifle democracy. What would be his response to the problem of freedom and inquiry? It would be to stifle inquiry. So just as we see with modern elections, when liberalism cannot produce more liberals, it turns authoritarian. This then forces us to ask the question, is it really even possible to institutionally teach people critical thought? Can we do as Popper prescribes and utilize pastoralism, which is the proposition that the state should look after the well-being of every individual, to universally create free thinkers? To anyone of reasonable mental capacity, the notion that free thought can be inculcated through enslavement is preposterous. The more regimented and factory-like education becomes, which is necessary on a universal scale in order to deliver education to absolutely everyone, the more conformist the result will be. And besides, is it even possible to teach free of biases? All the information we give to someone about history is necessarily biased by the selective use of viewpoints, and also the personal nature of those viewpoints we present, since all history is just a compilation of limited views and interpretations of those views by others. To actually test whether Popper is committed to critical thought, what would he have thought about revisionism? Should revisionism have a place in the school's curriculum? Should people even be allowed to be revisionists? Truly, I suspect, never again takes more priority for him than free inquiry. If revisionism leads to the closed society, Popper would most certainly not allow it. The basic fact of the matter is that what Popper actually means by education is to instill liberal values into the minds of students. He blithely proclaims that free inquiry will produce this, but what if he doesn't? He in reality does not so much disagree with Plato as he does with Socrates. If it is indeed true that free inquiry produced liberal results, I have no doubt that just as is the case with majority rule, he would dispense with it because it does not perpetuate the open society. And besides, if education should really be a matter of the individual, then what business do we have creating collective schools? These tools are only tools of state conformity. If Popper wants to be truly liberal, he should argue for the abolition of state education and let every individual educate himself or find himself an individual teacher. Universal education is universal subjection to power. The basic fact is that the pastoral attitude of liberalism contradicts the love of liberals for individual autonomy. I spoke about this in one of my previous videos, Liberal Totalitarianism, but the basic fact of the matter is that this liberal desire to ensure the best outcomes for every individual has the effect of individualizing power. And in the case of a system such as schools, the demand to bring education as a cohesive mass to literally everyone can only have the effect of actually collectivizing them through the individualization of power. If you want education to produce liberal values, then you do not believe in individual autonomy. Liberalism, in the modern sense, and authoritarianism are not actually antonyms, and it will become ever more clear that, especially in Popper, just as he argues is the case for Plato and his apologists, that we should trust what a person means by his words and not the words themselves. When Popper says democracy, he actually means authority. When Popper says critical thought, he actually means indoctrination. I'm going to skip chapter 8 because Popper's criticisms of Plato there are actually pretty good. In chapter 9, Popper contrasts his method of piecemeal social engineering with Plato's utopian social engineering. Utopian social engineering is the creation of a grand design for society, which is supposed to be reached through a sweeping reconstitution of society along certain rational conclusions. Popper holds that this must necessarily end in failure because the engineers lack the requisite experience and information to accomplish such grand reforms. He believes that any attempt to gain such knowledge, such as through experimentation, is going to fail also for two reasons. One, any utopian social experiment must be carried out on the scale of society as a whole, and so it is, in some way, indistinguishable from the grand design itself, as well as bringing forth potentially destructive consequences. Two, if social experiments were conducted on a smaller scale, such as in a village or in a province, the information thereby produced would be unrepresentative of what would actually happen if the grand design were implemented across all of society. In contrast to this utopian social engineering, Popper presents his preferred method of piecemeal social engineering. This kind of social engineering, he writes, is not based on any grand design. Its goal is merely to reduce human suffering, and this is accomplished by small-scale experimentation of a limited scope. The advantage of piecemeal social engineering is that, one, it's possible to have the necessary experience to carry it out, since its aims are on a much smaller scale and so map better onto practical experience. Two, if we do not have the requisite experience, we can gain it by implementing a small-scale policy and then tweaking it in response to its flaws or negative externalities. Although I don't see why this wouldn't have the same problem that utopian social engineering would have. In this way, unlike utopian social engineering, which is based on an inflexible and inalterable grand design, the objectives of a piecemeal engineering project can be changed depending on the consequences of the policy implemented. Popper notes that when a utopian social engineering project fails, it often results in violence. In the first place, it's necessary, as Plato writes, to establish a clean slate, which Popper sees as analogous to the policies of war communism from the early Soviet Union, which caused the Holodomor. In addition, if the social engineering project fails, then utopians will also use violence to correct the problems. There are a couple of issues with the way Popper frames this dichotomy. First, piecemeal social engineering in the real world rarely lacks a grand design. In fact, as Popper himself notes, a piecemeal social engineer might hold that human society will or ought to develop toward the elimination of all suffering and inequality. That is nothing but a grand design for society. We can also see, for example, that in the ideology of the Fabian Socialist Society, they plan to accomplish communism in the UK by way of gradual reforms. Thus, the purpose of piecemeal social engineering is to, step by step, accomplish a grand design. Second, we have to acknowledge that even piecemeal social engineering can cause the state to resort to violence if it doesn't organically get the result that it wants. For example, during segregation in the American South, the federal government decided that they wanted to integrate blacks and whites into the same spaces, particularly schools. Schools and the white public resisted these attempts, so the state resorted to using violence to accomplish integration. Initially, the Arkansas National Guard was called to quell civil unrest over the question of integration, but President Eisenhower issued Order 10730,
Execute Order 66,
federalizing the National Guard. After the order, the Guard forced schools at gunpoint to allow in black students. Also, if we look at the kinds of race-related speech reforms that are naturally occurring in the UK, we can see that hate speech laws and racial hatred laws are enforced by violence. In other words, enforced by the police. If white people insist on resisting this piecemeal social integration, then the state responds with guns. It's also worth noting that when piecemeal reforms fail, they can also lead to violence as an externality. For example, when New York implemented experimental $0 cash bail, Immediately, accused murderers got out and committed murder again. If we contrast both of these methods, we also find that they are more similar than different. They are, after all, both proposals for top-down social engineering. The danger of all social engineering is still present. The state's use of power can become so total that it quashes all human autonomy. Human prejudices or false information can result in policies that do more harm than good, such as the aforementioned $0 cash bail, based on an overly optimistic and egalitarian idea of human behavior. We might also think of proposals to give addicts free and clean doses of drugs, manufactured in state-approved labs with no concomitant effort to wean them off of the drugs. There's also the policy, implemented in California, of refusing to prosecute thefts of goods under $500, which has bankrupted some stores in particularly crime-ridden areas. On the utopian side, we can all see how disastrous the wide-sweeping social engineering of the Soviet Union was, or how a desire to reform all of society drove Pol Pot to commit his mass murders. Either way, misguided or false ideas about humanity have caused social engineering to produce vastly negative results. All social engineering has to confront the reality that certain outcomes are simply the result of the natural evolution of human behavior, and attempts to alter it can have unpredictable consequences or require constant repression, even violence. This isn't to say that all volitional attempts to intervene in society are bad. Rather, we must be very reluctant to even recommend social engineering and make absolute sure that our theories about the problem accurately describe why the problem happens, and also to ensure that our plan doesn't require any human oppression or lead to any human suffering. But ultimately, the proposal of social engineering itself is quite suspect. More or less, the whole leftist project of the past 50 years has been to pathologize some normal behavior, then to devise some schema of social engineering in order to combat it. First, this started with racism. Schools had to be integrated. A massive moralizing effort was made to eliminate white racial consciousness by associating it with the Nazis or the KKK. Then we had to have affirmative action, which is systematic discrimination against whites. Then they opened the borders and started openly advocating our replacement. Now there is an active effort to engineer culture and art, such as diversity, equity, and inclusion in video games and movies. The list goes on. Popper insists that society should be ran democratically, but who exactly chose all of the above social engineering? In the South, the whites who actually lived there continually voted in defense of segregation. It required a top-down authoritarian action by an outsider, President Eisenhower, to actually end segregation. No one voted for that. No one voted for Brown v. Board of Education. No one voted for open borders. No one voted for DEI. All of this social engineering has been foisted on us by powers that be without so much as a referendum. And yet Karl Popper, chief proponent of quote-unquote democracy, will defend this flagrant violation of democratic principles called piecemeal social engineering. All of this social engineering is based on many of the same faulty assumptions about human behavior that drove utopian social engineering in the Soviet Union: the egalitarianism of man, the indefinite plasticity of human psychology, the arbitrariness of social bonds, the harmlessness of state power, and so on. Popper likes to slam utopian social engineering for failing to have the requisite experience to accomplish its goals. But what if the piecemeal social engineers stop listening to the results that they get from their experiments? The result would be the same either way. Studies on contact theory prove that bringing blacks and whites into contact with each other did not reduce racism. Magnet school experiments prove that giving black students high amounts of funding, or rather black schools high amounts of funding, did not reduce inequality. And yet, how many liberals do we hear shouting from the rooftops that black inequality is the result of poor school funding, or that racism is caused by insular white communities? When the mass replacement of whites in Western countries is finally accomplished, do you think we'll see a decline in criminality or an increase in school performance? Of course we won't, because the people behind this piecemeal engineering don't know a single thing about human nature. Or rather, the most dangerous thing is that they do know something about human nature. It's just that their knowledge is completely wrong. It is a fantasy, namely faith in human equality. What is a problem for utopian social engineering is equally a problem for piecemeal social engineering, which is the fallibility of humans. Popper thinks this issue can be ameliorated simply because it's more distributed and smaller in scale. When all the people performing the social engineering are on the same ideological page, believing in the same collective fictions and delusions, it's as if the social engineering were a grand design anyway, just as is the case for the vast majority of anthropologists and a plurality of biologists who deny race and racial differences in humans. It has the exact same effect and the same tendencies toward failure and violence. The basic fact is that the top-down social engineering of any sort that we have in our society is incompatible with democratic freedom. We've already established previously that Popper is not actually a real advocate of democracy, and he proves it here more than anywhere else. If we actually had democracy in the age of segregation, we would still have segregation, not today's litany of social experiments. Finally, I must say something about Popper's hypocrisy here. In the following chapter, he will lionize the values of personal choice and individual autonomy, but just here, he has advocated for social engineering. Social engineering modifies people's personal choices in such a way as to reduce their agency. It is, in effect, a way of utilizing incentives to change a person's behavior from the top down, similar to Ludwig von Mises' praxeology, which is potentially a philosophy of social control. Popper is essentially saying here, you are allowed to have maximum personal choice as long as you abide by the state's limitations on your personal choice. He might, for example, decide that your choice to smoke must be limited through the use of disincentives on smoking, like increased tobacco taxes or restrictions on where and when you can smoke. Your choice then is reduced to compliance with the law or rebellion. You don't really have personal autonomy here. Again, when Popper says he supports something liberal, he shows that in reality, he believes the opposite. Now we arrive at chapter 10, where Popper discusses the history of Athens. Athens in the time of Socrates was at war with Sparta, and he portrays this as a struggle between the open society, represented by the Athenian democracy, and the closed society, represented by Sparta. I'm not all that interested in the comparison that he makes between the two cities, but what stands out to me mostly is his defense of Athens. Athens had expanded into an empire off the back of its forays into naval commerce. This commerce, he writes, was hated by the anti-democratic milieu in Athens, represented mostly by the historian Thucydides. Commerce necessitated contact with other cities, and it led to the dissolution of tribal identities within Athens. The traditional values of Athens also went further on the decline. The significance of commerce for Popper is that commerce marks the partial rise of what he calls the abstract society, which is a society in which people do not make interpersonal bonds with each other, but rather engage with each other impersonally through exchange, contract, and intermediary institutions. He redoubles how impersonal this abstract society is, presenting a hypothetically completely abstract society where people do not know each other's faces, ride alone in enclosed cars, and even have babies through artificial insemination so that they do not have to know their partner. This is the image he presents of the goal of the open society. If that sounds inhuman, egoistic, and morose to you, that's because it is. The benefit of the abstract society, as far as Popper is concerned, is that it promotes reasoning and personal choice rather than magical taboos, which is supposed to increase individual agency and happiness. But in contrast to this, Popper notes previously that the proponents of the closed society were sort of onto something with their diagnosis of society, that people are social animals and seek deep personal relationships with other people. We might even argue that the whole reason why anyone would even advocate for this closed society, as Popper frames it, is simply because they want a sense of solidarity, love, security, and belonging that the open society cannot provide due to its abstract and atomizing character. Popper has essentially made his own counter-argument, and shockingly, he doesn't respond to the obvious objections that critics might have made to his attitude. Popper further elaborates on what he sees as accurate in the diagnostics of that period's reactionaries, where he essentially discusses Plato's claim that the Republic would guarantee the happiness of the whole. He states that Plato saw the unrest and unstable nature of the period's social change and deduced that it made people quite unhappy. Popper agrees with this assessment, but implicitly argues that this unrest simply constitutes a kind of growing pain for the open society of the future, which will guarantee every individual the right to the pursuit of happiness. However, there's an obvious problem with Popper's view, mainly that he has just spent the former chapters of the book criticizing historicism and utopianism. Popper here is hypocritically presenting his own inevitable utopia, the final achievement of the perfectly open society, without considering what potential problems such a society might have, or what obstacles might stand in the way of its realization. In his historiography of Athens, he admits that the Athenian democracy had caused a significant amount of class conflict that did not exist before. He also admits that the rule of oligarchs caused internal instability in the city. We have no reason to think that this instability is a temporary condition. We can take this observation and carry it with us to today, where we witness constant kinds of class warfare in our modern societies that take the form of race riots, class demonstrations, as well as political conflicts and issues with oligarchical power. As I've argued in some of my previous videos, the concept of caste, which Popper associates with the closed society, actually forestalls class conflict by giving every man equal dignity according to his station. But once the liberals abolished caste and replaced it with monetary class, we saw the growth of the idea of social mobility. Being poor no longer carries a dignity if your rank and value is determined solely by the wealth you possess. No longer does your personality count for anything or your willingness to do your role in society. Thus, inequality is no longer seen as a natural partition that organically exists in society, but rather it became seen as an injustice that must be ameliorated either by politics or by violence. The instability of the capitalist open society becomes quite obvious, and having established this fact, we must call into question the achievability of the utopia that Popper presents. Can a society based on class ever solve its newly minted problem of inequality and injustice? It can try to appease the poor through reforms or a welfare state, but it can never actually eliminate inequality, especially if such a society is based on merit. Natural inequality means that meritocracy is always going to trend toward inequality. But if we take the doctrine of human equality seriously, as Karl Popper does, then this inequality must be seen as a total injustice. Groups will recognize this injustice and go to war over it. All the while, there becomes such decisive polarization in the polity that politics becomes increasingly violent and zero-sum. Social change ends up benefiting only one class or the other. Riots break out in the street. People increasingly come to distrust the mechanisms and institutions of democracy and come to see the other side of the polity as ontologically evil. No one can come to a consensus because there are no principles upon which a consensus can rest beyond the banal statement that we should, quote-unquote, respect democracy. The overall point I'm making is that the growing pains of instability, social change, and class conflict aren't growing pains at all. Those growing pains are the open society. Now, another idea that I must criticize is Popper's humanitarian doctrine of universal reason, which he expresses as faith in reason. Popper thinks that rational discourse naturally leads us to the open society, that it is a product of an open society in the sense that people can criticize whatever they want, but also that it is the very essence of the open society and leads to it. But there is a problem with any idea of faith in reason, which is that reason doesn't lead to any particular conclusion. Reason is simply a series of rules of internal consistency. A is C, B is C, so A must be B. Reason tells us nothing about what A, B, or C even are. So in other words, reason doesn't tell us which premises for an argument are true or false. Reason can thus be employed in the service of any doctrine, whether it be in favor of the closed society or the open society. The word faith comes from the Greek pistis, which essentially means trust. Faith in reason must mean trust in reason to perform some sort of task for some purpose. As far as Popper is concerned, this means that reason and rational criticism will dispense with magical taboos and usher in the open society. It is faith that reason will create the open society. But as I hope I have demonstrated on my own channel, I think that reason can lead us in the opposite direction of the open society, toward a defense of traditional values. When we see how modern society has turned out, full of conflict, teeming with atomized people who have a severe sense of depression and disconnection from the world, leading to genocides and injustices around the globe, such as the United States' support for Israel, when we see the explosion of internal political conflict that threatens to blow states apart, we must conclude, if we are to be rational, that Karl Popper's set of principles has not led to a better world. Yes, we may have more abundance, and yes, we may have more personal choice, but people are not more happy. Statistics actually show something of a happiness crisis that has intensified since the 1970s. People are not at peace. There is as much, if not more, injustice and inequality than there ever was. In fact, there is probably more inequality in general due to the forces of capitalism. If faith in reason is what has produced this, then I think we should take a step back and analyze whether reason, not guided by any superior principle, can actually produce a better society. The project of the Enlightenment was to emphasize reason as the guiding light for civilization. One would think that Popper is simply carrying forward the task of the Enlightenment, but Popper is ignoring that one of his most hated enemies, communism, is founded on more or less the same Enlightenment principles. He is not alone in proposing a rational society. Communism is deduced essentially from rational premises. These premises are held to be scientific. The doctrine of class war is reasoned to through social observations made by Marx. If we are to put our faith in reason, then Popper has to explain why reason should necessarily lead us to the open society rather than to the dictatorship of the proletariat. But the truth is that reason does have blood on its hands. Every totalitarian leader likes to think of himself as rational. Every murder has an intrinsic and consistent inner logic. Even further, the ideal of a completely scientistic society does not have a given endpoint. Every ideology likes to self-describe as scientific, including even the traditionalist ones, such as we might find in René Guénon when he refers to the traditional sciences. The scope of reason is so broad that we cannot say, without any antecedent guide, that reason is trustworthy beyond the fact that reason is internally consistent. What you get out of reason depends on your premises, and your premises might just be your own reified biases, such as Karl Popper's insistence that all men have the same capacity for reason. There's no world in which man can be guided by reason alone. Reason does not produce irrefutable arguments, since we can always interrogate the premises. Even Hegel, who Popper abhors, proceeded with his arguments in many cases very rationally. Ironically, although Popper criticizes historicists and totalitarians for dreaming of inflexible world pictures, it is he who is doing the same thing, and then proclaiming that reason irrefutably leads us all the way there. His faith, or trust in reason, is that reason produces the open society. We can see how this view is, in reality, no more sophisticated than those Chiliists who believe that their faith will produce the kingdom of Christ. There is a certain kind of revulsion that the phrase faith in reason should evoke in intelligent men. Reason is not a dogmatism, it is a method that has no absolute starting point. The phrase reads as if Popper were trying to desperately find a way to replace the political role that religion previously had in civilization, to give man a concrete set of morals and conduct. Of course, since reason has no starting point, it cannot provide a concrete set of moral principles, it can only legitimize our preferences. But nonetheless, the doctrine of faith in reason causes liberals to divinize reason as if it were a god on high, which in reality is just a self-serving absolutization of their own principles. This isn't a new tendency in liberals because they've been doing this as far back as the French Revolution, where the revolutionaries erected a statue of the goddess of reason, or maybe earlier in the American Revolution when they referred to the quote-unquote inalienable rights of man. They were only a few steps removed from worshipping the goddess of reason. Liberals desperately want their point of view to be irrefutable so that they can show just how irrational their opponents really are. But the reality is not that simple nor clear-cut. Liberalism is refutable, none of its propositions are objectively true, and one can just as easily make a rational defense of tradition as one can make of liberalism. This then brings us to another problem with Popper's doctrine, which is the Enlightenment idea of universal reason. This proposition has been attacked foremost by postmodernists who argue that reason is not an intrinsic human faculty, but rather it was something that was invented or socially constructed, which must be cultivated and chosen. The presumption that everyone in the world is a rational actor or operates according to reason cannot, in truth, withstand scrutiny. Primitives in Papua New Guinea are hardly rationalistic. They operate according to the magical taboos of the kind that Popper criticizes, and despite the passage of thousands of years, they have not moved beyond this mode of life. They have been given ample time for their so-called universal faculty of reason to develop and take the helm of their ship, but it hasn't happened. We can say the same thing for the Australian Aboriginals or African Bushmen. Why is that? Is it perhaps because reason is not a universal human faculty? Perhaps because reason is something that only some people in some places possess? As such, the idea that faith in reason can produce higher and higher modes of civilization becomes nonsensical. There's no such universal reason, and so faith in it can only produce disappointments. We see the modern victory of irrationality in art, in politics, and in social unrest. We see how, as I've shown in a previous video, that people largely do not even use their rational faculties when making important choices. The reality of reason is that it is something that is exercised in very few minds, even if most of us are nonetheless capable of it. A society based on rational rule would necessarily have to be ruled by a small minority of elites, which is something that Popper paradoxically supports, as if he secretly knows but won't admit that the masses tend to be irrational. This is why he has to defer to rule by institutions. He thinks regular people are so irrational that they will be hoodwinked by populists and demagogues into voting for the closed society. So much for faith and reason. In chapter 11, Popper begins his discussion on Hegel. I'm not that much interested in Hegel because, aside from orthodox Marxists, who appear to be dwindling in number, his influence has dropped to almost nothing. Genuine fascists who might be alone in being heirs of Hegel's doctrine of the immanent state are similarly few in number. Fascism in the 21st century is at most a radical intellectual curiosity, not a serious political movement. As far as National Socialism goes, Popper's belief that Hegel-inspired National Socialism is incorrect, and regardless, National Socialism today is more or less a form of socialistic national populism, and I predict that if it were to ever make political inroads, it would be in this modern form, though possibly not under its real name, as a synthesis between what Americans define as liberalism and conservatism. Speaking of definitions, it is here that Popper reveals perhaps why he plays fast and loose with the meanings of words in this book. Namely, he attacks the concept of definitions entirely. He associates the demand that philosophers should define their terms in argumentation with Plato and the Essentialists. He states that the Essentialist point of view is that every word has an absolute definition, which is derived through intellectual intuition. Thus, it is the special prerogative of the philosopher to define terms, to reveal to the world what they actually are and mean. Popper's problem with this view is that he thinks it leads to an infinite regress of definitions. If I say a chair is a piece of furniture designed for sitting, we then have to define what sitting means or what furniture means ad infinitum. This is certainly a real problem when we are tasked with defining an objective thing in discursive terms, because as soon as we admit the problem of language, we're in the realm of a subjective understanding of an objective situation. Because it's subjective, there's no possible way to create a universal understanding of what a word means. A person with the power of intellection may be able to sense what the objective essence of a particular thing is, but he cannot convey that essence to someone in an objective way. Any words he uses will be colored by the particular subjective understanding of that person, and if his subjective understanding does not approach the objective essence, the philosopher and the person would need recourse to a lengthy debate in order to convey the information, which by necessity will be imperfect since an essence is not an accident, i.e., a linguistic description of an objective form is not the same as knowledge of that form. Popper instead believes that nominalism decisively solves the problem of the infinite regress. We might give an obvious rebuttal, which is that this problem of the non-verifiability of terms exists whether you are an essentialist or a nominalist, but Popper does not believe so. He argues that in nominalism, it is not necessarily whatsoever to understand the definition or meaning of a word, because words are constrained by practicality and reference to measurable things. For example, if I were to say that a single nucleotide polymorphism is a location on a gene, we can understand through practical experimentation what is meant by that term without quarreling over the meaning of single nucleotide polymorphism. This argument is utterly facile. Is there any objective reason why a scientific term refers to a particular observable thing? It may be true that for a person directly observing a phenomenon, he could call it A and be absolutely sure that A refers to the thing observed. But when he tries to communicate that to other people, he runs into a problem. They have not observed the thing in question and have only heard about it. They are relying on the subjective definition of another person regarding the thing observed, which is exactly the same problem that essentialists have when trying to communicate essences to other people who do not share the power of intellection. We again also run into an infinite regress. A single nucleotide polymorphism is a single location on a gene. Now define location and define gene ad infinitum. Popper has not solved the problem. Popper even admits that degrees of precision might be a real problem for nominalism as well. Can we be sure that a term means precisely what is observed? Was there interference from other secondary observations? Is there a category error? Are we being too narrow or too broad? The parameters of all that are completely arbitrary, and so as a result, there could be no objective or definitive precision. There is also another problem with Popper's view. Is it at all possible to carry out the procedures of science without definitions or meanings? Sociology is comprised almost entirely of models and questionnaires. Both are heavily reliant on an intersubjective understanding of what these models and questions mean. If there were not a general agreement in society about what the terms used in a question mean, then surveys would never be valid evidence for anything. Even the harder empirical sciences rely on definitions. What is an up quark and what is a down quark? What about theoretical subatomic particles that have not and possibly cannot be observed? We know about them only through definition. Science in reality can never be carried out without some sort of agreement about what terms mean, which can only be carried out through rigorous discussion and consensus. Popper misses an important idea about language in this discussion, namely that language is intersubjective, not merely objective or subjective. The way we come to conclusions about the meanings or definition of a word is through agreement. The legitimacy of a meaning is proportional to the degree to which we can arrive at a consensus for what that word means. There may be a theoretical problem of the infinite regression of definitions, but the way we solve this practically is by coming to social consensus regarding what words mean. We might even go further and suggest, as Derrida does, that words are defined oppositionally through difference. Popper says we can't do any of this for some reason. Well, the vague reason he gives is that it doesn't solve the philosophical problem of the infinite regressive definitions. He won't accept that it doesn't matter here, because previously arguing that we should investigate not a person's words, but what they mean by their words. Evidently, what is a problem for Popper in relation to philosophy is not a problem for him in his day-to-day life, nor a problem for him in this book, except for this particular section, which calls into question how important the philosophical problem really is. If there is a pragmatic solution to it, which we employ instinctively and without any training, then the philosophical problem can only be an issue in the abstract. But since the whole purpose of this book is to understand a concrete historical conflict, that between the closed and the open society, it calls into question how important this problem really is, especially considering that both essentialism and his nominalism suffers from it. It may be a practical problem that we cannot come up with objective definitions for words, since it causes a great deal of conflict and disagreement and a lot of talking past people. But equally, we can solve this problem by simply coming to an agreement about meanings. In the case where a person obstinately refuses to accept any other definition than his own, then it would not matter if there were or were not an objective definition, since he would simply ignore it. Even objectively defining discourse cannot stop disagreement, since we always have a right to be wrong or to contest the objectivity of any truth claim. All this nonsensical and autistic hyperfixation on this infinite regress problem is just a justification for Popper to misuse language and confuse the reader, which is exactly what he accuses Plato of. Popper calls early Greek democratic thought humanitarian before there is ever a conception of humanitarianism or a universal brotherhood of man. He says that Plato was lying about what justice meant because Popper was relying on an anachronistic idea of liberal justice. Popper claims to be democratic, but in reality, he is a thinly veiled bureaucratic authoritarian. He claims he represents individual autonomy and personal freedom of choice, but then argues for social engineering. All of this is the reason why Popper here argues that we should dispense with defining our terms or arguing over definitions. It's because if we didn't, it would expose him as a hypocrite. In chapter 12, Popper begins his attack on Hegel. As I've already said, I'm not an expert on Hegel, and I've never read his works. Discerning whether Popper's critiques are accurate or not is a task for another person. So in the conclusion to this video, I will give some quotations from a countervailing paper to Popper's criticisms. All I want to point out from this chapter is Popper's hand-waving away of nationalism as irrational. His argument is, paraphrased, that all peoples in the world are mixed, so there is no common national origin, therefore all nationalism is irrational. Instead, he promotes imperialism and cosmopolitanism and notes that nationalism was largely a reaction against imperialism. It's very banal to note that modern peoples are a mixture of pre-modern peoples. This does not, however, eliminate the fact that distinct modern peoples do exist and have existed for centuries in common territories and often with common languages. Popper says that tribalism has always existed, which implies that there are, indeed, distinct groups upon which a nationalism can be based. Of course, as nationalism is a doctrine of particularism, it eludes a universalist definition of any one nation. Popper exhibits the autism typical of liberals from which originates their hatred of ambiguity or social negotiations of reality. All nationalism is an ongoing conversation, a negotiation and testing of boundaries. All human groups follow this pattern: self-distinction against other groups, collective identity, negotiated boundaries, and negotiated relationships. Of course, Karl Popper's abstract society in which all social bonds are torn apart in exchange for contractual relationships means that he must be against this process, against what constitutes the greater part of humanity. Any intelligent and rational person can clearly see that humanity is variegated and composed of different groups and categories of person. We can also see how people negotiate these categories and differences through self-identification and identification of others. To call this irrational is to essentially reject human nature itself as irrational, which is a contradiction of the liberal idea of universal reason that he espouses, which supposes that human nature is rational. Even if we admit that self-identity can sometimes be irrational, is nonetheless an important part of our human psychology. So important, in fact, that it cannot be eliminated. Even in regions that are thoroughly mixed, such as in India, people set themselves apart. The strength of our racialist instincts is demonstrated by the fact, as Ryan Falk has pointed out, that children will spontaneously spout quote-unquote racist things like, "Why is that man chocolate?" It requires social oppression or social engineering of the kind that Popper recommends to suppress that. Even if we were to reduce all humans down to an ethnically homogeneous mixed soup, people would still set themselves apart from each other on the basis of shibboleths or differences in taste, ideology, or personality. We see how children do this in high schools, for example. Our norms of trust, solidarity, and our ability to form a common matrix of meaning and communication is reliant on this quote-unquote irrationality. It would deal serious damage to us psychologically and socially to repress this mechanism, as has been proven in studies that show a sense of racial identity is psychologically healthy. In general, having solidarity with an in-group is very healthy for our social well-being, as well as for our ability to trust and predict other people's actions. In a certain sense, accommodating a degree of irrationality can be a very rational thing to do. This hypothetical modern man that liberals like to imagine, perfectly rational, a completely isolated individual operating purely according to self-interest, does not exist and can never exist until the liberals finally accomplish their dreams of eliminating humanity. And I don't exaggerate, since Karl Popper fantasizes about eliminating work through automation of machinery. The history of automation has proven that this never works in humanity's favor. It only leads to the marginalization of more and more of the population until all of humanity is in the margins. To return to the point of departure, racial identity does not even have to be irrational. The fact that we have closer obligations to those we are related to is contingent upon the understanding that we would not exist if it weren't for those relatives. Thus, we have a duty of care for our families and our offspring. This is such a rational point of view that modern law has taken it into account. For example, all laws against neglect assume that parents have a legal duty of care for their offspring, but not for another family's offspring since we aren't directly related to them. From the basic principle established that we would not exist if not for our family, we can extend our obligation in some form to the rest of our blood relatives, our race, and only our race, because after all, we would not exist if not for our race. We have a duty to ensure the well-being of our race in its existence. We have a duty toward nationalism. There is nothing irrational about it. And as far as a duty to humanity, one can only follow that in the abstract. That is, to have a duty to the human form. The actual concrete reality of humanity is that it is segregated and variegated, so a duty to humanity absolutely must include, foremost, a duty to one's race. And sure, modern races are technically mixed, but they're still distinct and have evolved according to geographical isolation. They may be mixed, but they are not arbitrary nor indistinguishable. They are discrete categories with fuzzy boundaries like colors and cannot be reduced to merely a soup because they lie on a spectrum. To do so would invoke the spectrum fallacy. Nationalism and tribalism, like anything, can therefore be defended on rational grounds. To demonstrate the limits of Popper's argumentation, we could even make a rational defense for the irrational, as Michel Foucault has done partially in Madness and Civilization. Even delusions can be rational, since a lot of people's delusions are internally consistent. The reason why they are delusions is simply because their premise is wrong. Regardless, simply because Popper wants to handwave nationalism away does not mean he can absolve himself from the task of understanding an idea he doesn't agree with. He has simply set up a straw man and then argued against it. It's true that some nationalists do believe in pure races, but not all do, especially not today. And when they say pure, they're usually using it in a purely relative sense, as in to say that their race is purely discrete. Knocking down purity as a principle does not defeat nationalism. It is just enough for races to be discrete, for nationalism to be rational. Likewise, Popper wants to pin the blame for nationalism on Hegel, and almost solely on Hegel. This is wrong in the first place because Hegel was an opponent of nationalism. If you look at the actual history of nationalism, most of it was accomplished by liberals, such as, for example, the Freemasons. America was founded by Freemasons, Italy was united by Freemasons, and they've had influence all over Europe. Today's forms of nationalism are not based on any Hegelian or otherwise grand historical schema. Differentialism, for example, is defended on the idea of difference. Most forms of nationalism today are foundational only on the claim that it is wrong to attack the existence of a discrete race, because that would constitute genocide and oppression. Modern nationalism really is quite liberal, if not even in some cases postmodern, and Popper does not seem to have anticipated that liberals or other people might turn into nationalists too. Variations on the right of conquest or historical destiny do not get to own nationalism because they did not invent it. One can go as far as to argue that no one invented nationalism. Nationalism just grew out of ethnocentrism, which is an innate biological trait that was the result of group selection. It makes one wonder what Popper would have thought about black nationalism, which is based on the idea that black people having their own homeland would free them from oppression. Freedom from oppression is precisely the doctrine on which modern nationalism is founded, and which is ostensibly a principle that Karl Popper adheres to. He has decided not to tangle with this question because it doesn't neatly fit into the schema of open society versus closed society. Popper must scare the reader by opposing cosmopolitanism to totalitarianism, as if the two might not be brothers, or as if nationalism could not be based on a principle that abhors totalitarianism. His motive is purely to prop up the moral righteousness of his stereotypified open society. This is the brand of intellectual paucity that runs through Popper's work. If nationalism appears, then it must have been the work of Hegel. If tribalism appears, then it must be heir to Plato. This tired intellectual genealogy, when confronted with the real world, shows its limits. The real world is very intellectually discontinuous. It brings to mind Christopher Lasch attempting to trace populism back to obscure Protestant writers who no modern populist has ever cited. People have repeatedly invented the same ideas independently. If you want to view it from a secular perspective, one could argue that the idea of the fall of man or of a primordial flood has been several times independently invented. One can say that maybe, at the time this book was written, the illusion between nationalism and Hegelianism might have made some sense, but as Keith Woods has shown, there's already a non-historicist tradition of nationalism in places like Ireland that was very liberal in character, so there's no excuse. Even the United States of America, which is supposed to be the model for the open society and which could not have been influenced by Hegel, was practically a white nationalist country after its founding. Apparently, even the scions of the Enlightenment thought that racial nationalism was sound and rational. The task remained for Karl Popper to confront a genuinely rational configuration of nationalism, which he has not done in his works. Now we arrive at Karl Popper's treatment of Marx, which is the complete opposite in tone and method from his dismissal of Hegel. It is clear, even explicit in the book, that Popper admires Marx. He begins by discussing the disagreement Marx has with psychologism. Marx believed that human consciousness arose out of material relations, and that individualist psychological explanations of human behavior were an example of bourgeois individualism. Popper starts by analyzing the psychologism of John Stuart Mill, which was deterministic in character, based on a generalized understanding of generational human behavior that has evolved since the beginning of mankind. Popper's critique boils down to his observation that human psychology does not exist in a vacuum, but rather there is a nexus between social behavior and psychological behavior, and as such, one is not inextricable from the other. Due to the fact that human choices typically have unintended consequences, he disagrees with the psychologistic notion that all outcomes are the result of psychological impulses. He calls that theory the conspiracy theory of sociology. In other words, the theory that all human outcomes are intentional. Sociology, he explained, is the study of the unintended consequences of human behavior. Thus, Popper's view of human behavior is rather holistic. He argues that behavior is not reducible to psychology, but rather behavior is a combination of psychology and what he calls situational logic. The example he gives is that a man avoids oncoming traffic when crossing the street, not just because of an instinct of self-preservation, but also because he is navigating the requirements and rules of the situation itself. To put it in another way, psychological impulses as well as sociological influences are part of the equation of human behavior. Popper praises the virtues of this holistic view, arguing that it takes from psychologism its methodological individualism, which discounts collective factors such as race or nation as explanations for human behavior. This is, of course, a questionable view since human individuals form and are influenced by groups. Popper puts all his chips in on individualism against collectivism, but we can obviously call this dichotomy into question. Individuals form groups, and groups consist of individuals. We have every reason to argue that, just as Popper holds that human behavior is an inextricable matrix between psychology and sociology, the behavior of individuals is an inextricable nexus between individualism and collectivism. The fact of herd behavior cannot be discounted, for instance, as Edward Bernays has dedicated much of his life to studying this phenomena, especially the effects of propaganda. There are even phenomena such as group delusions or temporary group psychosis, like folie à deux or the dance of St. John. There's also a rather obvious example of the existence of group behavior, such as the spirit de corps found in military organizations and the concomitant use of psychological techniques to break down soldiers individually so they behave in tandem. There are also some experiments on the problem of group behavior, such as the Stanford Prison experiment. Unsurprisingly, belonging to the group of guards led participants to become increasingly more brutal, since their group role was to suppress the prisoners. Their individual faculties of empathy or theory of mind did not stop them from identifying with their group role rather than identifying with the persons of the prisoners. Other experiments on racial bias prove that belonging to a race alters a person's behavior, although they did find that white people exhibit no racial bias, probably because this is the result of the social oppression of white collective racial identity. Studies also routinely find that people tend to seek out social groups comprised of their own racial group. It may be technically true that all sociological forces, including group belonging, operate on the individual mind, but it does not mean, therefore, that we can declare as null the effects of groups or the existence of collective influences. One statement made by Popper is rather revealing regarding what the true nature of the open society really is. He argues that the closed society does not admit to any kind of sociology because it is organic in nature. It does not seek to socially engineer human behaviors, but rather allows human behavior to function spontaneously as if in a tribe or collective. In contrast, the open society relies on social technologies, which it uses to engineer individual behavior. This is an implicit admission that not only is the open society totalitarian, but also that sociology and psychology are disciplines of social control, and that social control is an indispensable function for the creation and operation of this open society. Since humans naturally identify tribally and form natural social bonds with each other, the open society must use psychological repression and sociological engineering to break apart these bonds so that people can become isolated, quote-unquote, individuals. We find accordingly that despite Popper's pretensions against totalitarianism, he was arguing for the most thorough and severe oppression of humans that is possible, control over their minds. We can see in the modern prevalence of therapy and the rise of calls and attempts by politicians to control disinformation, as well as the mania over various kinds of quote-unquote extremism or quote-unquote radicalism, the traces of Popper's mentality applied in the real world. The use of AI to surveil, track, and control individuals is only part and parcel of what is necessary to keep the open society from falling apart into anarchy and social revolution. If nothing else, Popper makes an excellent premise for the adoption of the attitude of anti-psychiatry and a radical critique of science that borrows some cues from critical theory, namely the proposition that we should ask what the outcomes of research would be rather than to be content to allow it to describe reality. Popper then says something quite indefensible, which is that in Marx's writings, there is a kind of dualism between the ideal, which he associates with the mind, and the material, which is the bodily realm of metabolic necessity. Marx talks about the realm of necessity, in which man is confined by capitalistic domination, and the kingdom of freedom, which is man emancipated from necessity and drudgery. Popper uses this dichotomy to determine that Marx was not a simple and total materialist, arguing that he held some value and belief in the quote-unquote spiritual side of things. But when Popper says spiritual, he is reducing the spiritual to thoughts and beliefs. He doesn't actually mean anything nominal. In the sense that Marx disbelieved in spirits and gods, we can say affirmatively that Marx was entirely a materialist. In regard to this supposed dualism that Popper talks about, he seems to imply that there is a realm of human consciousness independent of material relationships in Marx. But a statement Marx made, along with Engels, contradicts this view. Marx says that consciousness is determined by material relations, not that material relations are determined by consciousness. This is a clear rejection of this dualism that Popper is talking about. Popper later argues that we should not take historical materialism too seriously, as situational logic and psychology do play important roles in history. But what this reveals is that Popper's overall motive in misinterpreting Marx as a dualistic thinker is simply to project his own disbelief in historical materialism onto Marx. When Marx talks about the kingdom of freedom, he doesn't mean that people will no longer labor, nor that human consciousness will be freed from material relations. He simply means that man will have the freedom to control material relationships and thus control their consciousness. The relationship between base and superstructure is never contradicted. Marx maintains that the mind, which is superstructure, is determined by man's labor. The end goal of society, for Marx, is really that man should be free to pursue the labor that he himself wants to perform. This labor might be transformed from merely productive into artistic, for example, but it still remains labor, and materiality still exerts its influence over man's consciousness. Marx's distinction is mainly that the future of man will be in the hands of man, which is why he speaks of man being liberated from animalistic conditions. The primacy of human volition in the course of man's destiny is a principle repeatedly valorized in Marx, despite his historicism. He doesn't necessarily mean that man consciously arrives at this state, rather he means that it will eventually become a reality due to historical processes. He puts the future into the hands of man as a historical actor rather than some Hegelian world spirit or divine providence. In other words, it is a historicism that operates through man. The end goal of this historicism is the achievement of a future where man is his own sun, as he has said in one quote, "Man lights his own way, he creates his own future. His future is bound up inextricably with his material conditions, which, at the end of history, he will finally control. He will control his consciousness not through control over the realm of his spirit or mind, but rather through control of labor. The central principle of historical materialism never collapses into a dualism." If this dualism does actually exist, then Marx has contradicted himself. I don't put it beyond great thinkers to fall into contradictions, because as Popper has demonstrated, even Plato's work contains a mess of contradictions. And if you want to think Popper is a quote-unquote great thinker, well, we can see how this has turned out. However, I don't think that Marx would have erred here, since this error would have been exceedingly obvious to him. It would blow apart the whole theory of historical materialism. In reality, I do not believe that this dualism even exists, and the reason for that is because Popper is misinterpreting what Marx meant by freedom. The concept of freedom for Marx never denoted a psychologistic conception of consciousness. Freedom was the state of society being organized by man directly, such that the problems of exploitation and inequality could be resolved. The kingdom of freedom is the elimination of the bourgeois negative freedom that leads to the centralization of wealth in the hands of a small elite. Marx's freedom is a positive freedom, the freedom from capitalism, which becomes the state of equality. Popper almost seems to reinterpret Marx's vision of freedom in negative terms, as if man will be free to do whatever he wants at the end of history. But this is false. The freedom that man gains in the end is precisely communism. William Clare Roberts also gives us a more accurate picture of the kind of society that Marx imagines at the end of history. Freedom from domination without independence. Marx accepted that people in society, due to modern relationships of production, would be interdependent. He did not reject this, but rather argued that this interdependence should be voluntary and freed from the exploitative relationships of capital and wage labor. Man is still determined by that interdependence at the end of history. The economy doesn't disappear. Rather, man takes his place in it as his own sovereign. He is not under the dominion of anybody else. He becomes his own ruler. In such a way, communist man is free from the world of necessity, free from the artificial scarcity supposedly introduced by the capitalist mode of exchange and production, without the presumption that his consciousness determines itself. Popper then goes on to discuss Marx's view of the state and political power, which I'm not really going to comment on because it seems accurate as far as it goes. The basic gist is that Marx believes that political power is forceless in comparison to productive relationships which determine class relations. Popper comments on the fact that Marx is not afraid of unchecked state power. He notes that Marx is wrong about political power because economic factors are undergirded by state policy. In response, he does say something which stands in direct contradiction to his previous views of democracy, which is that political democracy is a good solution to economic exploitation because it inverts the relationship between oppressor and oppressed, i.e. the rulers are determined by the ruled. Popper has previously denounced the idea of the general will and has recommended that democracies be governed by institutions. In what way does this signify that the rulers are determined by the ruled? Popular sovereignty ceases to have any meaning outside a certain status as a useful legal fiction, when the actual center of power in a country is its institutions. If an institution wishes to set limits on what kinds of policies can be voted for, or which are available, it can do so. It may happen that these institutions wish to protect big industry and corporations, and might prohibit socialists from running for office. This is to some extent what happened inside the DNC. Bernie voters were furious when the DNC decided to slant the primary against Sanders in 2016. The Democratic Party has, for all of its modern existence, placed pro-capitalist candidates in the spotlight, and donors have given them most of the support for obvious reasons. It turns out that these institutions are actually the one thing that prevents a revolutionary economic policy from being implemented, and yet Popper has the gall to declare that this situation is akin to the rulers being determined by the ruled. The only circumstance in which this institutional problem would be avoided is under something like direct democracy, the very thing that Popper attacks as falling victim to the paradox of freedom. Apparently, popular freedom is the only bulwark against an oppressive state, but we must quash popular freedom because it is a black road to totalitarianism. We're damned if we do, and damned if we don't. Popper would rather have a self-managed capitalism that occasionally throws a couple of bones now and then to the proletariat, rather than a revolutionary society. The obvious answer to this problem is to address the central issue that requires us to have institutional protections in the first place, which is the exploitative nature of capitalism and its refusal to distribute wealth to those who need it. The two solutions lie in either distributism, in which the state divvies up capital and gives it to people so they can become self-sufficient, or socialism, in which the wealth generated by production goes to those who produce and need it, and is otherwise distributed according to the needs of individuals. But liberals steadfastly refuse both of these, instead opting to continue putting up appearances that a capitalist system can never be moral or democratic. Popper is so needlessly terrified of a liberal system, his own excluded, that he is forced into a situation in which he must accept the disastrous consequences of a relative economic freedom, only with a little bit of impotent management. Popper argues that interventionism has to accord with this concept of piecemeal social engineering, and that it has to take place in an institutional legal framework. He states that the benefits of such an institutional approach is that it prevents arbitrary use of state force, which introduces instability and unpredictability into the economy. However, we can just say in response that Popper has previously obliterated the distinction between personalism and institutionalism. He has completely forgotten that this was his position, since he argues here that institutions are completely impersonal. If we take what Popper said previously into account, then this means that institutional power is not an objection to the arbitrary use of power, since the people who run these institutions can always use the institutional power they have arbitrarily. This problem occurs for every law, since laws can always be enforced selectively. This insistence on a soft version of interventionism is hard to understand, because Popper does support extensive use of power in various domains. Rather, it just seems he is so scared of socialism that he decides that the economy is the one thing we should treat with kid gloves, and merely applies some form of piecemeal interventionism. It turns out that the open society is only open for some people, mainly ideologically liberal oligarchs who can make just as much wealth as ever despite interventionism. We must recall the oligarchs who existed in Athens, which was, according to Popper, the open society of ancient Greece. Today we have George Soros with his Open Society Foundation. He is surely carrying forward Popper's legacy, using his outrageous personal wealth to support social engineering and atomization, turning society utterly sterile, all the while leaving the exploitative engine of society largely untouched. Then in subsequent chapters, Popper critiques what he calls Marx's prophetic argument, which is historical materialism. Again, I'm not going to go over much of what Popper has to say about Marx, but I just want to highlight a very good observation he makes regarding social revolution. There is an inner contradiction between Marx's historicist thought process and the effort to increase class consciousness through mass action. Marx's prophecy is that the increasing misery produced by capitalism will lead to the spontaneous emergence of class consciousness among the proletariat and a consequent social revolution. But Marx, in various places, also seems to argue that the proletariat should strive to improve their conditions under capitalism through organization and mass action, which would reduce the amount of misery caused by capitalism. This poses a contradiction, since the trigger that is supposed to cause the social revolution is misery, but if the proletariat work to reduce the rising misery caused by capitalism, then the trigger for that social revolution ends up disappearing. Popper writes that Marxists, if they are to adhere to historical materialism, are therefore forced to argue their efforts should not be made to improve the lives of the proletariat. He notes that the proposition Marxists would then make to workers, which is that they should continue to become more and more immiserated until they have no choice but to revolt, would end up being rejected by the workers since they are seeking, above all, a solution to their misery. They would not willingly tolerate more misery for the sake of revolution if they had a chance at reducing it. And so Marxists are, in the end, unable to generate class consciousness. What actually happens is, as Popper implies, fascism becomes victorious instead, since it promises workers class integration and better conditions through its rejection of historical materialism. Although the prophetic position logically follows from Marxist principles, all but the most radical Marxists seem to have rejected this idea, instead opting for working toward improving the lot of workers under the system in an effort to produce class consciousness. This is represented perhaps in the most concrete form in Social Democrats. But if you look at Marxist spaces online, You'll find the more radical leftists arguing that social democrats are fascists or reactionaries, since they are merely reforming capitalism rather than working to destroy it. In other words, they are responsible for the ability of workers to tolerate capitalism, which evolves into a new form that is better able to stave off revolution by meeting some of the needs of workers. Despite the fact that workers are better off under reformed capitalism, they are no closer to actually getting rid of capitalism. Arguments over this question raged at the turn of the century, particularly among syndicalists who were discussing the merits of, for example, raising wages over attempting to eliminate the wage system. It appears that reality bears out Popper's criticism. Marxists either reject historical materialism in order to achieve reforms that end up in the end maintaining capitalism, or they accept historical materialism and then assert that no effort should be made to improve conditions for workers, which ends up backfiring by not producing class consciousness. In the chapter Aftermath, Popper lays out some of the epistemic arguments typically made by Marxists and Hegelians. The Marxist point of view he calls sociologism, which is the belief that our knowledge is necessarily circumscribed and determined, either wholly or partially, by sociological factors such as education, morality, or environment. In other words, they are declaring that our scientific beliefs are molded by our biases. The Hegelians argue that our knowledge develops unevenly since humanity is not unified in particular places and times. This is called historism, which is not the same thing as historicism. Popper's critique of sociologism argues that sociologism is a kind of relativism, whereas science, because it follows an impersonal method, is objective. He calls this the intersubjectivity of the scientific method. Experimental results are verifiable, falsifiable, and replicable by others, so the truth of a given claim in science is not dependent on any particular individual and whatever biases he might have. But is this true? Is science objective because of this intersubjectivity? Intersubjectivity does not fundamentally eliminate the problem of the unevenness of subjective experience. Language is intersubjective, but no one would dare proclaim that language is objective nor impersonal. Instead, we understand that language is a kind of negotiation between subjects, as I previously said, where we legitimize our understandings based on agreement. Science, then, is basically the same thing. We legitimize truth claims based on agreement, which is arrived at through experimentation and then discussion about that experimentation. The actual objective truth of any given matter is never arrived at, since all we are capable of achieving is agreement on the outcomes of experiments. Popper himself previously said that science never deals with proof, it operates completely probabilistically. As such, we have to admit that science, by itself, cannot approach objectivity. Popper writes in his usual jargon, arguing that these epistemic quandaries can be resolved through quote-unquote social technology and quote-unquote piecemeal social engineering through the quote-unquote creation of institutions. He doesn't elaborate exactly on what this means. Does he mean enforcing the scientific method by law? Does he mean teaching the scientific method to everyone and democratizing science? We cannot be sure, but regardless, this is not in any way a sufficient response to sociologism. I think it's rather unobjectionable that all scientific pursuits involve our human biases. The reason why a person prefers sociological explanations over hereditarian ones largely comes down to the factor of ideology, as is proven by the other intransigence of sociologists in the light of hereditarian evidence. The two fields rarely, if ever, come into actual conversation with one another. Mostly the environmentarians are trying to stamp out hereditarian research. The fact that scientists, who should be concerned with verifiable truths above all else, often believe in the presumption, or bias if you will, of human equality means that our biases do infect the scientific process. They determine which hypotheses we pursue. They determine how we interpret results. If you give a sociologist and a biologist the task of interpreting the Minnesota transracial adoption study, you will get two wildly different accounts of what the study indicates. The sociologist will state that the inequalities found are the result of a legacy of oppression, and so rearing a black child in a white adoptive family cannot ever be sufficient to ameliorate centuries of inequality. The biologist will plainly interpret the study as evidence for their hereditarian hypothesis. Further, the way we model studies, the way we frame questions on surveys, and the kinds of questions that we ask are further susceptible to human bias. A good example of this I found was in a sexual study where they asked participants what their opinion on the Bible was or how often they went to church. The study presumes that everyone taking the survey will be a Christian, which in light of the fact that the United States is actually comprised of several different demographics, is a clear example of cultural bias that might impact the results. Further, we might note that scientists are always moral actors. They determine what is acceptable to research and what is not, according to their moral ideology. Sociologists often proclaim that it is immoral to research racial differences or the genetics of race because it might lead to eugenics or genocide. Some similar concerns exist for practices like embryo screening, which might also lead to eugenics or to the genocide of autistic or gay people. If we step outside the domain of scientists for a moment, we can see how people are very afraid of the consequences of the development of AI. Many people want all development into AI to cease completely so we can prevent the replacement or oppression of human beings by machines. That scientific developments are, in reality, not impersonal, but rather strictly personal, means that our moral biases inform chiefly whether to employ the scientific method or not. In regard to Hegel's historism, Popper just blithely assumes that Hegel's hypothesis is false and that humanity and human reason is intrinsically unified. Is this not one of Popper's own biases? Can he actually prove this? Is this a scientific opinion at all? We've already noted that Papua New Guineans haven't attained the same rational faculties as Europeans. It'd be trivial to also note that if you took a Papua New Guinean and tried to teach them the scientific method, you would not be able to follow it. The fact that the scientific method originated in Europe rather than any other place indicates that there is a certain historism to the scientific method and to science as a whole, even if we are to assume that it is completely the result of environmental inequalities, which of course is no reason to do. In other words, for some reason, not everyone is equally as rational. Even postmodern authors recognize that rationality is not universal. Perhaps then Hegel was right about this. What this chapter exposes, more than anything, is that Popper has a quasi-religious faith in human reason and equality. He thinks that reason leads to the same conclusions regardless of who operates it. He thinks that humans, everywhere and anywhere, all share the same mental faculties and approaches to knowledge. He has not exposed any of these presumptions to the hard contest of facts, nor has he endeavored to look for any scientific proof for them. Liberalism can only survive if we insulate its assumptions from inquiry, which is why I stress so much that Popper would be likely to restrict it once it becomes obvious that inquiry does not lead necessarily to liberal conclusions. Perhaps the only reason Popper wants to rescue science from the criticism of biases is because he himself is quite biased. In the next chapter, Popper sets up a dichotomy between rationalism and irrationalism. As Popper explains, rationalism is the employment of reason through argument in order to establish truth. Irrationalism is the belief that passions and feelings take precedent in human conduct over reason. Rationalists believe in the unity of mankind and the universality of reason, while irrationalists believe in inequality and the unevenness of reason. He goes on further to argue that rationalism leads to a humanitarian equalitarianism, while irrationalism leads to what he calls crime, or hierarchical domination. Reason follows the Christian commandment to love thy neighbor, or in other words, to respect the arguments and positions of other people so as to learn from them, while irrationalism sets up friend-foe distinctions. Popper associates rationalism with Socrates and the open society, while irrationalism is characteristic of Plato, Hegel, and the closed society. Rationalism is capable of determining truth through testing arguments, whereas the mysticism, as he calls it, of irrationality is immune to testing or criticism. I must first begin by noting that, like many of Popper's dichotomies, this one is highly artificial and does not describe the reality of the choice we have to make as a society, i.e. the choice between democratization of rule and the principle of hierarchy and sovereignty. Popper's association of inequality and hierarchy with irrationalism shows the poverty of his thought, because one can just as easily arrive at inegalitarian and hierarchical points of view through reason instead. My video on the weakness of rational choice theory is precisely this, because I have shown through several studies that human intuition and moral emotion tends to prevail over reason in most tests of human decision-making. When we compare how traders trade versus how they claim to rationally navigate trading, we find inconsistencies. They are deeply affected by how they feel about a particular economic situation, regardless of cost-benefit analysis, which was proven by the fact that traders were more risk-averse during the 2008 financial crisis than they claimed being. Even George Soros has admitted to making trading decisions based off of hunches, i.e. he decided something was wrong in his portfolio because he had a backache. Additionally, I also showed that there are intense framing effects in political and democratic matters that are wholly irrational. After having established that the so-called irrationalists are correct about the general lack of the employment of reasoning in the population, I went on to argue that allowing the population to make decisions about the government is simply going to cause the rule of irrationality. Political Republicans realized this a long time ago, that giving equal rights indiscriminately to just anyone would lead to mob rule. What would be necessary to prevent the rise of irrational policy is to have an elite who are proven to have the capacity and aptness to reason in matters of politics and morality, an elite who are trained in the use of reason and who have the agency to use it. This position I reason to on the basis that reasoning and intelligence are unevenly distributed, so in order to guarantee that society is ran according to reason, it would be necessary to somehow select for people who are actually rational to run society. And this was previously the purpose of the aristocracy and later the Republican restrictions on franchise. I have arrived at this position through scientific evidence and the rational process without any intervention from feelings or any kind of mysticism. It must also be noted that rationalism is not immune from what Popper deems as crime. In World War II, the government put ethnically Japanese civilians into concentration camps. Our quote-unquote rational democracy nuked Nagasaki and Hiroshima, killing millions simply because they are in the same society as our military foes. As Carl Schmitt has argued, the basic logic of politics, whether it's rationalist or irrationalist, is existential self-preservation. This requires us to discern between friends and enemies. Consequently, reason puts people on the other side of a friend-foe distinction all the time, as Popper himself demonstrates. He argues that the enemies of the open society should be suppressed and punished. The basic reality is that one can acknowledge inequality and even acknowledge the limits of reason to ascertain truth, and still believe that reason is the best way we have to determine truth claims. As such, the line between irrationalism and rationalism becomes very thin, and as demonstrated by the behavior of the Allies during World War II, it's not as though reason is more humanitarian than anything else. And even further, something like state eugenics and sterilization programs are completely rational, and they are anything but humanitarian. Reason can lead to the opposite of humanitarianism. For these people, the proper argument against them is that they are so obsessed with reason and efficiency that they have actually begun dehumanizing people, and dehumanization is one of the arguments Popper notes that the irrationalists make. It turns out that reason, if not tempered by our moral intuitions, can turn into a monster. I will, however, give Popper some credit, as he does in places demonstrate that a society founded on rational argumentation is better than one founded on emotionalism or entirely on myths. He says, for example, that reason allows us to resolve conflicts without violence, while emotionalism requires us to use violence since it can never come to a compromise, because it isolates two individuals inside of themselves. Although one must note that reason has its limits in the field of conflict resolution, those who want demographic replacement and those who want a white majority can hardly come to a compromise. The only real problems with Popper's view are his association of reason with humanitarianism and egalitarianism, and his presumption that all humans are capable of reasoning. I otherwise fully agree that it is good to have a rational basis for society. Now, Popper does acknowledge in this chapter that an absolute presumption of factual human equality is probably false, and that this fact in no way requires us to treat people differently. But we have to question whether Popper genuinely believes in natural human inequality, considering he has also stated his belief in the universality of human reason. Further, he ascribes to the idea of a universal human brotherhood, which implies factual equality by the nature of that argument, i.e. that humans are defined only by what they share in common. Popper genuinely does seem to think that all people are factually equal, not just in the de jure sense. But this brings up an issue I spoke about earlier, which is that if we treat all people equally, and they are in fact not equal, it will lead to inequality and suffering on the part of those on the lower end of the bell curve. This is a typical Marxist critique of liberalism, and Popper does not foresee the objections that a person who genuinely believes in the goal of equality would make. The only way Popper's recommendation would lead to an equal society free of suffering is if all people have genuinely been born equal, so he is almost required to believe in factual equality. Otherwise, he would be a hypocrite. All this piecemeal social engineering is contingent on the presumption that humans are equal, and so if we remove social obstacles that stand in the way of their flourishing, such as example discrimination or exploitation, they will be equal. If it's true that humans aren't equal, then social engineering of any kind cannot end suffering. To sum it all up, we have seen how Popper misuses language and excuses himself for giving false impressions to the reader by arguing that no one should define their terms. Popper's book is all the much weaker precisely because it evades the task of definition. If he called it something other than a defense of democracy or a defense of liberalism, if he called his society something different from the open society, it might be more honest. But what is democracy to Popper? He uses the word to give a congenial impression to the reader, all the while concealing his true meaning. A self-sustaining, bureaucratic authoritarianism whose only motivation is self-preservation, not liberty. Liberalism as a whole has followed Popper's attitudes and arguments, Countries around the world are interfering with the democratic process where it leads to right-wing victories. They are utilizing the institutions they have set up to annul results and ban candidates. Every liberal country has what amounts to an institution of secret police, whose job is to persecute and surveil anyone who doesn't support liberal policies. The freedom of inquiry and speech practically no longer exists unless you live in the United States, and even there, it is under attack both by Democrats and Republicans. One might think that these developments have been the result of illiberal forces taking control over our democracies, and that a suitable effort must be made to defend democratic institutions. At least that's what the enemies of the right have proclaimed. But the reality is that liberalism has done this to itself. The greatest threat to democracy is liberalism. They have followed the logic of self-preservation so closely that they have practically eliminated the presence of the will of the people. I will appreciate the degree to which Popper is willing to engage with his enemies, with the exception of Hegel. He clearly has extensive knowledge of some of the philosophers that he has covered, particularly Marx. I am not an expert on Hegel myself, but other people are. On Hegel.net, there is a rebuttal against Popper's treatment of Hegel. Popper presents Hegel as heir to the Nazis, and yet Nazi literature hardly ever mentions him. Quote, Hegel is rarely cited in the Nazi literature, and when he is referred to, it was usually by way of disapproval. The Nazis' official philosopher, Alfred Rosenberg, mentioned and denounced Hegel twice in his best-selling Der Mythos des Zwanzigsten Jahrhunderts. Originally published in 1930, this book had reached an edition of 878,000 copies by 1940. In the same book, a whole chapter is devoted to Popper's beloved Schopenhauer, whom Rosenberg admired greatly. Rosenberg also celebrates Plato as one who wanted in the end to save his people, Volk, on a racial basis, through a forcible constitution, dictatorial in every detail. Rosenberg also stressed and excoriated the quote-unquote Socratic elements in Plato, end quote. Popper contends that Hegel's philosophy can be used to justify any and all domination, and further that Hegel was essentially acting as an apologist for the Prussian state. However, quote, Hegel also speaks of unalienable rights and condemns without qualification slavery, serfdom, and disqualification from holding property, or the prevention of its use or the like, and deprivation of intelligent rationality, of morality, ethics, and religion, which is encountered in superstition and the concession to others of the authority and full power to determine and prescribe for me what actions I am to perform, or what duties my conscience is to demand for me, or what is to be religious truth for me. According to the edition of Gans, the editor, Hegel remarked in his lectures in this connection that, quote, the slave has an absolute right to liberate himself, end quote. Hegel further states that hatred of the law enables us to detect moral corruption and hypocrisy, and he also in various places rejects racism and anti-Semitism, and yet Popper makes Hegel sound like an utter proto-Nazi. Popper then criticizes Hegel's view on inequality, in which he argues that under a state, laws must imply inequality. But the author responds, any state with laws implies rulers, and if rulers have power over the ruled, then there is inequality. Any state implies inequality. Any law implies inequality. This is what Hegel meant, not that the state should take measures to increase the personal inequalities of subjects. Then the author adroitly points out a contradiction in Popper's writing where he defends the imperialism of Napoleon on the basis that it was supranational. This is supposed to be against Hegel and the Nazis, who emphasize emotionality and tribal violence. In reality, Napoleon was not a rationalist in any way. His conquests were certainly the result of the influences around him, as well as his own personal equation. Praising Napoleon but condemning Hitler, as if Napoleon were somehow on the side of reason and Hitler against reason, makes no sense. Popper argues that Hegel was an apologist for nationalism, but handwaves away Hegel calling the nation rabble and opposing the racist and anti-Semitic French liberal nationalists. Further, Popper, without so much as a single quotation, then libels Hegel as a racist himself. We can see the degree of intellectual honesty we are working with here in Popper's book, and forgive me if any of Popper's interpretations of classical philosophers are wrong, because I largely have not read them, and I wouldn't put it past him to very terribly misinterpret these classical philosophers. So we have arrived at the end of this review. If you made it this far, then thank you for watching the whole thing, and I hope my criticisms have helped you understand the philosophical and political poverty of liberalism, as well as the hidden dangers that can, and probably will, cause it to become totalitarian.